Welcome everyone. Glad you could make it to the three selves, self-advocacy and empowerment. I'm Alyssa DeFilippo, Director of Parent Services here at Matrix Parent Network, and I have the pleasure of introducing two professionals who work with PEP, Professionals Empowering Parents. It's a community of professionals dedicated to educating and empowering families of children with special needs in the Bay Area. We have Dr. Maggie Benedict-Montgomery. She is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in individual and group therapy with children, adolescents, and families. Her work focuses on children and adolescents with mood and stress-related disorders. And we have Colleen Arnold, who is also a Dr. Colleen Arnold, a recent graduate with her doctorate, founder of Arnold Advocacy, and she's a special ed advocate and consultant working with families in, I guess, the Bay Area as well, mostly Marin and Sonoma County.
So we're going to cover the three selves today. We'll be talking about self-advocacy, self-determination, and self-compassion. And just a brief show of hands, how many of you, through your icons, how many of you have familiarity with at least one of these three selves, these concepts or these ideas? Thumbs up. Great. Some familiarity, awesome. And some of, you know, many of us probably are more familiar with one over the other two, or maybe two out of the three, or maybe all three, and maybe you're interested in hearing how they will all sort of come together and fit together. And so Colleen and I will be taking turns, going back and forth, speaking about first sort of situating us all and contextualizing and thinking about what is self-advocacy. So how does self-advocacy work? What are the benefits of self-advocating for ourselves? You know, I think as educators, professionals, parents, guardians, caretakers, coaches, whatever our roles may be, we probably have a lot of practice advocating for others. But there's also a really important, very important sort of personal development piece around self-advocacy that we often are hoping to foster within those that we work with or support, but also within our own life areas where we can self-advocate. And then we'll also be speaking about specific examples of self-advocacy in real life. So the stories, you know, the ideas, the things that we can really put to use right away. Then we'll transition into talking about self-determination, thinking about the components of self-determination, thinking about the ideas of application and goal setting, how to reach self-determination and apply self-determination for our kids, for ourselves. And then we'll transition into speaking about self-compassion. We'll talk about what is this idea of self-compassion? How is it different from, you know, sort of the ever popular, ever discussed idea of self-esteem? And then we'll integrate these three puzzle pieces and we'll think about how a model of self-determination and self-advocacy can come together with self-compassion and how they can kind of coalesce in order to further our the experiences of those that we support and ourselves. And throughout the process, we'd really love to invite questions. If you're comfortable sharing about your own experiences or experiences of those that you work with, please do use respectful language around how you're, you know, how you're referring to clients if you're a professional, and just be mindful of, you know, sort of our different roles as we're speaking about those that we support. But please feel free to share your experiences and ask the questions that you are curious about and things that come up.
Okay, and obviously it was interesting reviewing this presentation based on where we are all in the world right now, and how even just more important revisiting these topics are. So when I think about self-advocacy and now in this kind of distant learning world, when I think about working with individuals with disabilities and just working on my own self and working with my children, we really have to think of self-advocacy as an essential skill. It's something that has to be developed. We can't just assume that our students or students or children are able to advocate for themselves. I think one of the things that comes up for me a lot in my work is, people get to high school or college or their adult life, and it's just kind of assumed that they are able to have this foundational skill. But I think especially when we're looking at working with individuals with disabilities, there are some components that we really need to foster from a very young age and think about how this evolves over time. So looking at kind of what the research states, right? So through the IEP, there's a more formal process. There's this formal transition plan that's really looking at, what do we want to do? How can we be successful in our life? What are our personal goals, and how do we, take the steps to meet them? But there's also an informal component where, self-advocating might be learned through sports and friends and having mentors in the community, especially mentors who have a really diverse background. And whether that means others with disabilities or different ethnic or cultural backgrounds, that's all really important to instill in ourselves and in our clients. So when we think about what self-advocacy looks like, we know that it's really important to have an accurate understanding of our disability, whether it's our pattern of strengths and what's challenging for us. And that conversation really develops from a really young age about how the lens of, our patterns of strengths and our patterns of needs are evolved. So knowing those strengths and challenges. I know right now I just had a student who emailed me and said, I can't make a 9 a.m. Zoom when I'm not sleeping right now because, this whole COVID situation has brought me this level of stress. And to be able to understand what the needs and supports are based on where we are is just so critical. And then what gets more complex is how do we ask for what we need in relation to disability? And for different individuals, that might look really differently based on your comfort level in communication. I have an awesome friend right now who is in college and is advocating for himself by sending along a letter, an intro letter to all college professors saying, this is who I am, this is my disability, here's what works for me, and here's what doesn't work for me. And that's been really empowering for him, but also has taught, his professors a lot about who he is before he even comes into the classroom. And again, I think proactive is a really important part of that effective communication. So what we're really looking for, when we think about self-advocacy, is how do we cope with the discrimination and bias in the world, right? And being able to feel strong and empowered to push through and build this resilience. Again, in the current state of where we are right now, and using technology so much, which it's interesting for some of the clients I work with, has actually been a real positive experience. Whereas for others, to sit in front of a computer and be exposed to, to not get that human interaction is really challenging. So we're really looking to build that resilience. How do we make sense of what's happening, of these experiences, without internalizing? If as an individual you're experiencing discrimination or bias, how do you still have a positive view and sense of self moving forward? And in order to do that, we have to look at having, the accommodations and the supports that are needed. I think about, that there's often misunderstanding socially. Again, this is a fascinating time in regards to that. But thinking about, the longer goal of what we want, which are adults who are able to determine what their personal narrative looks like and how they're going to get that success in life. And I think while this is all very, abstract, these concepts, we can really pull it in to looking at what concrete steps can I take, and how does that look across the age ranges? And we're gonna try to do that a bit today. So this is an example, thinking about personal drive, self-determination, but also the self-advocacy component of a more practical example of what I might thinking about the IEP world in particular. This was actually a checklist that one of my clients and I worked on together, where we took his accommodations that worked for him in the classroom, and we created a little cheat sheet. And what he did was he had it, and I think this was a high school student, he had it in the front of his binder. And anytime he had an assignment or a long-term assignment or an assessment, he would go through these accommodations. And what it did first was it helped him to recognize, okay, this is what I need to be successful. Here's what I helped to collaborate and create within my own IEP. And now I have a really easy way to actually advocate for that. So for some students, they have that self-determination, self-advocacy at a higher level where they can actually pull it out and say, yep, I need my audiobook. That's a part of my accommodation. For other clients, they need more support where we're working one-on-one with the resource specialist or with a parent. They might send it ahead of time to their teacher as a reminder. Because what we want to do, and I'm sure we have some parents on this Zoom today, is transition, right, the advocacy from the parent eventually to the child, to the adult, to the young adult, where they're taking on more of those roles. But in order to do so, we really have to model. We can't go from fully supporting and then saying, oh, well, you're in 5th grade now, you're gonna have to remember to pack your backpack and do all these things. Instead, what we really have to do is create tools and systems to slowly hand off. And I think this is one that I've seen be really successful, especially for our middle and high school and college students when they're ready to take on some more of that advocacy for themselves. Okay, so thinking about the self-determination, we kind of talked about this pyramid, that the skills really are building on themselves. And the most basic skill, my example of the cup, the color of the cup for a younger child, is that choice. Because without having the self-awareness and empowerment to make a choice, we're not going to be able to build up into these more complicated skills, right? Where we're looking at, okay, solving a problem, making a decision, setting a personal goal. And when I think about the IEP world, obviously so much of it is around goal setting. But how do we get our young adults invested in that goal setting, so that when we are sending them out into this world, we have a real developed sense of self-awareness and self-advocacy. So for me, getting our clients, getting our children involved in that goal setting process as early as possible can be super empowering. I've had students self-monitor their goals, where, you know, they knew they were working on their reading fluency, and once a week they would graph their progress. And that was a really visual, positive way to say, look, I'm improving over time when I practice. You know, how can I get more involved and more engaged in the goal? I always joke that an IEP is, you know, not supposed to be this dusty, well, not dusty anymore, I'm aging myself because now it's all online. But it's not supposed to be this dusty piece of paper that we just look at every progress report, right? It's really supposed to be something that's alive. And by getting everyone involved in the goal setting, whether it's independent living goals for our, you know, older students, or whether it's, you know, a more simple academic goal, I think is really key. So we talked a little bit about how, and I'm always looking at how does this look to a 3-year-old and how does this look for a 45-year-old, right? So, you know, obviously we're serving such a huge community. So when we think about the self-determination, I think a lot about this generation and giving them the opportunity to make safe mistakes, right? So giving the space and the time to fall a little bit, to, you know, maybe not advocate for your accommodations and maybe see the consequence of that. And then having that discussion around, well, why was that so challenging? What happened differently this time? Again, you know, I am a firm believer in the open discussion of disability. I know that for a lot of families, especially at the early stages, perhaps initial diagnoses, or that's a lot more challenging because you're going through a process as a family. But in my experience in my work, I've seen the positive benefits that a wide variety of individuals have, really understanding their disability and being able to create a community, right, of people who are like-minded, or, you know, they can see an adult with autism being successful in college and really relate to that, which is huge. And again, we can think about all of this also through the IEP process. It's a part of natural life, but also more formalized in the IEP. So when I think about this, I definitely shared this document with you guys, and it has a ton of choices, which I just thought was really interesting, because what I always struggle with is, okay, so self-determination is this abstract concept, but how do I build it every day in life? And, you know, the choice making is key. When I think about, you know, a 4th grader coming to their IEP, being invited into that environment, how do we prepare them for that, right? One thing I've done with a lot of my clients, I have this one client who came to me and she had an amazing, robust IEP. She was a middle schooler, but she had about 45 accommodations. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed just reading this. And her and I sat down together before the IEP, and she was very real with me. Like, I would never use a slant board. That makes me feel too different. It's not helpful. And we really just collaborated and went through each accommodation and prioritized. I said, let's try for a list of 7 that really speak to you. So really thinking about how to get our kids involved, you know, having kids identify, what am I good at? What am I interested in? It's almost like when I, again, compare it to the IEP, I think about the present levels page, having them draft their own version of that can be just a really fun way to promote that self-determination. So when thinking about the self-advocacy piece, problem solving is key, right? So, you know, again, I described the example of my daughter self-advocating for herself and asking for a timer. In our house, it's Alexa. Alexa's everything. Alexa, set a bedtime timer. Alexa, set an iPad timer. Without her, I don't know that I could parent. So that's definitely a fact. But when my child self-advocates and it's a long day and I haven't left the house, and she wants 5 minutes of iPad, but does it in a way, instead of crying or throwing it at me, does it in a way that shows that she knows how to advocate for herself. Me respecting that is the best thing I can do, right? Because later when she's in a situation, she's going to know that the people, whether it's her boss, her teacher, a friend, that her voice is important and should be respected. Leadership roles are key. I know we're all at home so much. My daughter's now making my coffee, which is the best thing I've ever taught her. So any kind of leadership, giving that, ability to speak up in class, and what does that look like for your child? I have, more complex students who use technology to communicate. And so speaking up in class is really challenging. So we look at the topic ahead of time, and they might pre-plan using Proloquo, what they're going to say. So really thinking about how do we make this accessible to all of our students, no matter how complex their needs are. And I know some of you probably have seen the big push in the Santa Rosa City School District around inclusion and the parent community. And I'm going to blank on the name, but I'm sure you guys all, some of you, the parent community that's working on speaking in schools and talking openly about disability and listening to those that have disabilities as experts and speaking about their success and what works for them. And I think that is so important. Connecting with adults, successful adults who have advocated for themselves effectively and can talk about the trials and the tribulations and the successes, and really make it real for our students.
Great. So now that we've talked a little bit about self-advocacy and self-determination, some of the threads that I want you to keep in mind are a couple key points. So number one is, and we're going to do a little exercise. I want you to all think of something that you failed at. And something that no matter how hard you tried, just did not work out. And I just want you to notice as you're thinking about it, what comes up for you? What are some of the things that you start to say to yourself? What are some of the emotions that you start to experience? What are some of the sort of thought roadblocks that might come up and might even prevent you from thinking about something that you didn't do well or made a mistake or failed on? And I want us all to remember and keep in mind that Dr. Arnold pointed out that self-advocacy and self-determination both require the ability to fail and make mistakes. And so I just want to hold that when we ask our kids to make mistakes and be okay with it and to fail and to learn from it, we're asking them to do something that's really hard. And so that's where self-compassion is really going to come in to this puzzle. And so as we're going through and defining what self-compassion is and thinking about how it's different from self-esteem and identifying how it might plug into this self-advocacy and self-determination processes, I want you to sort of hold, in this unique time, in this unique era where we are probably faced with more mistakes and failure than we have for maybe some time, and maybe some more struggles, different struggles than we've previously experienced. I want to just sort of think about what what do we notice as we start to think about our own reaction to not being able to get something right, not being able to do things successfully, not getting the reaction or the response that we expect from other people, making a big mistake, maybe even something that had very real consequences. And the reason that I'm inviting us to think about it is because as grown-ups, as I pointed out, as grown-ups, when we are, let's say, I'm sure many of us have experienced this, talking through the natural or logical consequences of a behavior with a kid, we are asking them to go through the process of regulating their emotions and their emotional response to making a mistake. We are asking them to ask for what they need and talk about why they chose to engage in certain behaviors, or helping us describe through their words or through their behaviors why they were doing the things that they did, why they made the choices that they make. And it's a really complicated and challenging process that requires a lot of strength and emotional regulation and ability to sort of be settled and calm and centered in ourselves. And so as we think about the experiences that our kids face, the challenges that our kids face, and supporting them, one of the things that we can always fall back on and go back to is this idea of self-compassion. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about self-compassion, but before I do, I'm going to invite you all to please just indicate in some way, either through the chat or using your screen or using an icon, whether you're familiar with the idea of self-compassion, the concept of self-compassion. Have you heard of this before? I see Christina says yes. Okay, so this may be a little bit of oh, and I see Alyssa. So this is kind of might be a fresh idea, and I'm really excited to talk about it. But I do want to just hold that when I first got introduced to the idea of self-compassion, I was in graduate school in my getting my doctorate, and I was, for any of us who've experienced graduate school, it is a place where you're constantly feeling less than. Oftentimes you're sort of functioning in a space of brain overload, information overload. And I was really struggling myself to integrate the information, the great stuff that I was learning, while feeling constantly like an imposter, and while feeling constantly like I shouldn't be here, I'm not good enough to be here, this is ridiculous. How do I keep getting through? Am I tricking my professor somehow? And I stumbled upon this idea and actually ended up writing my dissertation on it. But it has always been a struggle for me. So even though I'm teaching you about self-compassion, I want to just hold and acknowledge that I am a novice in the area of self-compassion myself. So this may or may not be a bit of a do as I say, not as I do situation. But as I was saying to Colleen and Erica and Alyssa before the training, the great thing about learning about self-compassion is that we can all fail, and we can all own it and acknowledge it and talk about what it means to not be able to access self-compassion in the moment, to not be able to feel connected to others and instead to feel isolated, or to feel so overwhelmed that we shut down. And so the self-compassion as a concept is sort of an overarching theme, but also a series of different strengths and tools that we can use to plug in order to be able to grow through our mistakes, and in order to be able to really honestly and clearly understand who we are and how we move in the world and how we interact with others. So the idea of self-compassion actually emerged from the academic research of Dr. Kristin Neff. And I don't know if some of you may be familiar with Dr. Neff. She is out at University of Texas, Austin. And she is a cognitive psychologist, developmental psychologist, and she is a practicing Buddhist, and she was exposed to this idea of compassion, which did not separate the idea of compassion for others, which is oftentimes how we think of compassion. So focusing on externally, focusing on others and attending to with care to others, versus the idea of using that compassionate way of being, but turning it inward on ourselves. And this was sort of overwhelming and mind-blowing to Dr. Neff, and she speaks about it in her books. And she also is a parent of a kid who's autistic. And so she, was here, she's doing all this cognitive research. She's a psychologist, and she's also parenting a child with special needs. And she was feeling so overwhelmed and needing something to sort of anchor and guide her. And she began to explore this idea of turning compassion inward on herself, and then did what they do in academia and did a whole bunch of research and studies and developed this sort of construct, this sort of idea, this theory of self-compassion. And the way that self-compassion works is that it's a dialectic concept. So there are three sort of self-compassionate ways of being, and then there are the opposite, or sort of other sides of the coin to those three ways of being. And self-compassion, as we think about it, as we measure it, involves the balance between those, the tension between those six sort of ideas. And so I'm going to kind of just give some brief understanding of the three self-compassionate ways of being, and then I'll go into their sort of complements as well. So the first idea is that we respond to be self-compassionate would require for us to respond to ourselves with kindness. So treating ourselves kindly. The opposite would be treating ourselves judgmentally, so self-judgment. And a practical example of this would be, as we were talking about, our own thoughts about what we failed at, something we failed at, or something we made a mistake while doing, would be this way of thinking about a mistake and saying, that was so stupid. How many people had an experience like that, where you're thinking about a mistake you made and it felt like that was such a silly mistake, or I really blew it? I know that's one of my go-tos for sure. So that's reacting to an experience with a self-judgmental way of being. Self-kindness, a way of thinking about ourselves in the moment that would be full of self-kindness would be to react with understanding and gentleness. So it wouldn't necessarily involve an explanation, but it would be reacting in a way that is maybe the way that we would react to our best friend telling us about a mistake. Might be a good way of kind of thinking about it. So with the gentleness and care that we might respond to someone who we love, who made a mistake and is telling us about it. The second core component is mindfulness. So mindfulness involves a way of being in our bodies, a way of reacting that is connected and that is in the moment, without getting overly tied down to the emotions that come up. So mindfulness is here, over-identification is here, and over-identification with our emotions can be either in a sort of over-expressive kind of way of overly identifying, or in a avoidant and withdrawn kind of way reacting. So a great example would be, I'll just use one from me the other day. This was I think I have usually, I'm like on a monthly shelter in place meltdown schedule at this point. I was kind of on a weekly schedule, but I think I might be, my resilience might be building. So pat on the back for that. But my tomato plant that I've been babying and really treating well got knocked over in a windstorm. And I ran into the house and just screamed into my pillow and was like just sobbing, tears running down my face. And my 5-year-old's just like, wow, you're really mad, huh, Mom? And I'm like, yeah, I really am. In that moment, that was like the over-identification. My emotions were revving. I was involved in sort of this cycle of spinning myself up into the emotion. It wasn't getting the emotion out in a way that was ultimately productive. And so I had to calm myself down and get into a place where I could take an action that would ultimately solve the problem. Did I do it? Yes, my tomato plant, I got it strung back up. It's okay. My big fat juicy tomatoes are still on there, so all is well in my world. But the other side of the coin to over-identification with emotion would be shutting down. So in other situations, I might just walk away from that tomato plant and be like, oh, well, it's done. I'm just going to throw it in the trash and it's gone. It's gone forever. I'm not going to even think about it or pay attention to it. And both of those are overly identifying with the intense emotions that are coming up, but not leading to an outcome that lets me solve a problem. On the other hand, a mindful response to intense emotions would be to feel the intense feelings that are coming up, to notice them, to hold them, and then to release them. And so the third piece, and this is the one that I think I struggle with the most, is that in moments of distress or intensity or failure or mistake making, a self-compassionate way of responding to those situations would be to be able to acknowledge that the experience of pain and suffering and distress and sadness are universal human experiences. And so being able to remain connected to my humanity and other people that I know and care about versus isolating and feeling alone in my pain. And so I don't know about all of you, but I noticed that one thing that can be incredibly challenging for me when I'm having a really hard day is being able to keep this perspective that this is a hard day and that others might be having a hard day too. I tend to do sort of the more isolation approach and be, scrolling through social media and seeing everybody's beautiful sourdough loaves that they're baking and think about how they must have a bigger kitchen than me or whatever I might be, fixating on. And that it can really perpetuate the cycle and keep me feeling isolated and keep me feeling alone and keep me in those over-identified emotions. Whereas, there's certain people in my life who I can, call and vent to, who can give me a little bit of misery loves company, and then I feel great and I feel plugged in together. And I know my best friend also burned her sourdough loaf or whatever it might be. And so that ability to sort of tap back into our feelings of connection can allow us to move forward instead of staying in a stuck place. So I want to kind of invite us all to just sort of think about those three ways of being and their opposites, and just to hold, where might you be stronger in self-compassion and where might you struggle more? And I just want to give just a little snippet, which is that in my dissertation, when I looked at the areas where people struggle the most, self-kindness was really hard for people. And I just want to hold that, in our sort of American culture of achievement, that making a mistake and failing, I mean, there's that lovely phrase, failure is not an option, right? And that's not true. Failure is always an option, and actually maybe even more likely than success, depending on how hard the task is, right? So I think it can be really, really hard to remain kind to ourselves when we make mistakes or when we're not successful. And you know that I think there's a self-criticism that comes from just some of the components of our cultural lived experience and some of the narratives. And I think this is something that in particular could be really challenging for our kids and families who experience stigma and discrimination, because that can be a social narrative and a lived experience that gets internalized and turned inward. And so, you know, that this is something that we as those that love kids who have disabilities, or folks with disabilities ourselves, or you know, folks that support people with disabilities and communities with disabilities, that we are, you know, we're going to have to do modeling, and we're going to have to do some extra work, because this is potentially going to be an area that's really hard for us. So the way that self-compassion works based on the research is that it allows us to develop a more realistic view of ourselves. So I'm not great at softball. I played softball. I tried to play softball, and then I learned that I wasn't great at softball. But because I also had soccer as an option, which I was good at, I could really see, like, hey, maybe hand-eye coordination in that way is not my forte. Maybe I'm better at, you know, running up and down a field and like running into people and whatever I do on the soccer pitch. But if you don't have feedback from your environment, and you don't have the ability to regulate your response to not being able to be good at something naturally, then it's going to be really hard for you to assess who you are and what your strengths and challenges are. Self-compassion can also help us cope with failure. So I make a mistake, I can't do it. That picture that Colleen had on a couple slides ago of the kiddo falling off the tricycle. We all fall off our tricycle when we're learning to ride, right? And as adults, we have a lot less practice of coping with that level of failure, that number of times that we fail. Our kids probably, the kids that we support, probably have even more opportunities to make mistakes and to fail and to struggle. And so self-compassion can really be a factor. Self-compassion can allow us to acknowledge and respond to challenges in our environment. So remember, we looked at that pyramid of self-determination and that problem-solving piece, right? So, oh, nope, I'm not going to do it that way. That doesn't solve the problem. Okay, I need to stay fluid. I need to stay flexible. I need to try a different approach. That is going to be fostered when we're able to regulate ourselves using self-compassion. We're able to soothe ourselves and to sort of stay on track, even though we weren't able to do the thing at the beginning. And ultimately, all of this is going to lead to resilience. This is all going to lead to a sense of self that's more accurate, realistic, and it allows us to respond to challenges effectively. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion. So self-esteem, I think self-esteem is wonderful, and I'm not knocking it, but I think that we, as supporters of kids and parents and just culturally, we need to foster with equal importance self-compassion. So self-esteem has been found after decades and decades of research to actually have some significant drawbacks. So for instance, those with high self-esteem are actually less accurate in their evaluations of how they will perform and in their evaluations of themselves. So someone with really high self-esteem is going to say, yeah, I'm so good at parallel parking. I'm the best at parallel parking. In fact, I don't know anybody who's better than me at parallel parking. Even if they've got like 5 fender benders under their belt because they keep knocking into people when they try to parallel park. So that's not an accurate evaluation. And that's not really effective at teaching them to be a better parallel parker, right? Because they're not going to try, they're not going to learn, they're not going to expose themselves to more situations where they need practice, or they're not going to ask for help because they already think that they're great at whatever it is. Self-esteem can also, because it's not accurate, it's not based on an accurate foundation, it can be fragile. It can be something that falls apart when you get evidence to the contrary of what you believe about yourself. So that's going to lead to consequences when you don't succeed. So that could lead to consequences to, sort of a shaky sense of who you are. That could lead to more intense emotional response. So sometimes, impacting your mood or impacting your behavior. So lashing out or feeling frustrated or irritable when you can't do what you predict that you'll be able to do. They've also more recently found that high self-esteem, more along the lines of like really high self-esteem, is related to risk-taking behaviors, and then of course levels of narcissism as measured sort of in terms of personality traits. So patterns of behavior related to this inaccurate sense of yourself as really, really good at things that you're not actually really good at. And, I think maybe in the last 5 years or so, there's been a bit of a backlash towards self-esteem around some of the challenges with taking personal responsibility after mistakes. So this idea of, if I think that I can do no wrong, then I'm less likely to, apologize in meaningful ways or change my behavior in meaningful ways. And so, self-esteem is really, it's based around the idea of comparing where you fall as compared to others around you. And so in order to succeed, you have to be better. You have to achieve more than others around you. And so that can inherently foster some competition, and that can inherently foster a sense of a scarcity of resources, the understanding that in order for me to succeed, they have to fail, and vice versa. If I fail, then that's what let them succeed. And so this isn't necessarily the kind of approach that we want to take when we are trying to engage with others in a team setting, for instance, right? I mean, we want to be able to be really accurate with what I do really well and what you do really well, and let's work together to achieve a common goal. Self-esteem is not necessarily going to be the ticket here. Okay. So I always use the word failure when I talk about self-compassion, because it is such a intense word. I think, I don't know for you, but when I hear the word failure, I'm just like, oh no, ooh, I have bad feelings about that word. And the reality of the word failure is that we all fail. Babies fail constantly when they're learning to crawl and roll over and walk. Failure is not solving a problem, not being able to achieve a goal, but it's not the end of the road. And resilience and grit and self-determination and self-advocacy all rely on being able to move past that failure point and into the next opportunity. And so with self-compassion, which is a concept that's actually designed to help you succeed and move through failure or mistakes, it's a really natural fit for a self-advocacy model for folks who may have a harder time or a more challenging time, especially when the environment is not going to be able to accommodate them or is not going to provide the supports necessarily that they're able to access. So self-compassion is really going to help us be kinder and less self-critical to ourselves. It's going to help us be more receptive to feedback that could make our life better. So I think here, you know, we all have our own responses to critical feedback, right? Like some of us can take it in from some people, and then other people, if they say one word, it's just like, no. I don't know if any of you have worked with kiddos who can hear you, but can't hear their parents. That happens sometimes, right? Or can hear a teacher, but can't hear a sibling or a friend. Oftentimes as kids move into adolescence, it's like their friends can say almost anything to them, but their parents can't even ask them if they brush their teeth. So, it just depends oftentimes on who's delivering the message, but self-compassion, because it's based on an accurate sense of who we are, can sort of help us be able to receive feedback from a variety of different people without being threatening and scary. One of the areas that self-compassion is really excellent in is promoting social interactions. So, you know, being able to help us understand when we made a mistake or hurt someone, and being able to do what we need to do to repair a relationship, or being able to navigate conflict, being able to move through conflict. And then forgiving ourselves and others, being able to say, yeah, that was a big mistake, and I'm going to ask for what I need because I was hurt or because I hurt someone else. I'm going to offer support in certain ways. And so being able to sort of improve that sense that I can solve these problems and I can do it, and I have what I need within myself to deal with these tough situations. In the research, self-compassion has been found to be linked to all sorts of great stuff, but especially is linked to the development and maintenance of self-care strategies, something that we as caretakers and supporters of kiddos may struggle with sometimes. Maybe I'm just generalizing here, but I certainly struggle with self-care. And has also been found to be a protective factor against internalization of stigma and negative attitudes about high needs and special needs children. So for those of us who are actively looking for ways to resist stigmatizing messages, harmful discriminatory messages, biases that we encounter out in the world, self-compassion can be a really good addition to the toolbox and way to sort of help us provide a buffer. And this also applies not just to discrimination and bias experienced by children and families with disabilities, but also those who experience discrimination and bias in different ways. So when we think about intersectionality in identity and, our cultural, ethnic, racial, gender, sexual orientation identities, and our membership of groups who may be experiencing marginalization, discrimination, and bias, this is also an excellent tool to provide support and to sort of be a shelter for us. Okay. All right. So this is the integrated model. It's an integrated model of self-advocacy and self-determination and self-compassion. And here are the key factors. A, learn as much about my disability as possible. So this includes naming it and understanding the impact of my neurodiverse brain, my way of taking in information, my memory, my ability to listen to verbal language and written language, and how I respond to others in my environment, my sensory interests, all of these areas of functioning and how they intersect and how we experience the world. Being able to identify my own strengths, my own challenges, and my level of resilience and coping skills. So what are my go-to self-care strategies? What are the things that I do that I know work? What are the things that maybe I don't know, maybe I haven't found effective strategies. And so then this is an area of intervention where, as a professional or a parent or a student, we can say, okay, this is an area that I need to work on. Sometimes early in the self-determination and self-advocacy process, this is going to rely on more input from adults or people who know us well, because we need to hear from other people who've experienced us doing these things in order to sort of take in this information and to give us some ideas. Identifying skills that have worked in the past, things that have been used to advocate for myself. So this is going to be something like, you know, Colleen, you brought up the example of your awesome college friend who is sending out these letters and, you know, must have at some point figured out that they are able to communicate really well through written language and can form connections with others through written language. And so great. You know, you can write a mean email, or you can say exactly what you mean and be understood in that medium, then go with it, run with it. Absolutely. And you don't have to necessarily show up to professors' lab hours, right? You can do it in a different way. Thinking about areas where self-advocacy is hard or not happening. So I see this a lot in high school. I see this a lot in sophomore and junior year, where students do not want to be, they want to stand out, but they want to choose how they stand out. And so they're not comfortable accepting accommodations that they may have previously been fine with. So like extra time even, that, you know, is kind of the most basic of accommodations. But then they fall behind, and then they're in this sort of snowball effect of, I can't get the extra time I need. I can't talk to my teacher about it because I didn't talk to them at the beginning of the semester or the trimester. And now I'm super behind and my teacher thinks that I'm slacking off. And so starting the process earlier and really thinking about what's hard, what do I need, and why is it hard for me to talk to my teacher? And talking it through, you know, talking it through with someone that you can trust. Oftentimes for older adolescents, this is going to come from their chosen community, their friends, their coaches sometimes. Typically, that's sort of where this process can sort of start to bubble and ferment. And then sometimes parents and other adults, we might just hear once they've already sort of worked it up to a certain level. Maybe when it's a more fully formed plan, or vice versa, when it's all exploded and it's like, whoa, we got to do something now, right? So this conversation should definitely be an ongoing conversation. I think there's also something really important to the emotional piece here as well. So not just identifying what doesn't work in terms of too much homework, but also understanding the emotional experience and our reactions to it. So I think a classic example is procrastination. I don't know if folks have read I believe it was a New York Times or maybe the Atlantic published a piece on procrastination and how recent research has found that it's actually an attempt to regulate our emotions. It's actually most people procrastinate because we are having intense emotions and we're trying to manage those intense emotions. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, procrastination is like, when I think about this assignment, it makes me feel so concerned, or it makes me feel so worried, or it makes me feel badly about myself. And so I can't do it right now, is definitely something that can be experienced. And so just attending to the emotional world and what comes up. And so then you start to get into generating strategies to overcome barriers. So what can I do to change the things in these situations? Here is where, as adults, we are oftentimes giving some options. So just like Colleen described, you've got a list of 45 accommodations. we're going to just go through, we're going to go down the list and we're going to choose the 7 that feel right to you. And those will be our 7 go-tos. This is also a place where, you know, thinking about executive functioning, depending on our kiddo or our young adult, like they may or may not have the muscles, those frontal lobe muscles yet to flex. And so, you know, there may be more scaffolding or support that we need to provide. And then as they start to build those muscles, then we can sort of back off a little bit. Finding community resources, plugging in, finding mentors and coaches, people who get it. Practicing self-advocating. So for some of us, that might mean actually role playing, right? I know I can just imagine all of the teenage sighs that are happening right now, you know, and thinking about role playing with your parents or your teacher, how to approach someone. But practice makes perfect. And especially when social anxiety has snuck in and anxiety about performance or anxiety about other people's response, we really have to practice. So that's a key piece of this. Conversations, role playing, thinking about our own response to being rejected. So what happens if I ask for help and the person says no? That's going to happen at some point. How do I persist and move into a space where I'm more firm rather than sort of just letting it go? And then using self-compassion to, you know, meditations, visualizations, building these school skills, working, sometimes this might include working with a coach or a therapist. Sometimes this might include doing an online self-compassion program or, you know, taking out at Spirit Rock. Sometimes there are self-compassion programs that we can take and that are available too. And then I think maybe most usefully is really earnestly and honestly celebrating successes of self-advocacy. And so I think sometimes, I mean, maybe folks might have heard about this, but there are now classes that are offered at Cal that are like adulting for college students, and learning to do things for college students. And I think that there's some sort of minimization that sometimes happens around, like, everybody should just be doing these things. But the truth is that these things are hard, and these things take practice and skills and tools. And especially for our kids, we need to celebrate these moments of self-advocacy, these moments of setting goals and self-determining and making decisions to go for something and going for it. We have to celebrate those moments. And we also have to celebrate them for ourselves, right? Like, hey, I did the thing that I didn't want to do. Yeah, it took me 4 hours, but I did it. And now I don't have to think about it ever again. We got to celebrate those moments. So this is a model. For how to integrate the self-advocacy skills that are needed, and use self-compassion to sort of plug in the gaps. And so when we're performing self-advocacy well, we typically are more in the self-esteem zone, right? We're like, I can do it. I'm confident. I can solve these problems. But when we're not doing well, we need self-compassion to be able to move through and say, okay, what wasn't working? Who do I need to ask for help? How do I need to support myself? How can I be kind and gentle with myself? And so self-compassion is kind of like a safety net, I think, is maybe the best way to think about it.
I think it might be time to thank our presenters for their enlightening presentation. I thought it was wonderful. So thank you so much. We can look for more presentations perhaps from the good doctors.